Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Medicine Grand Rounds and the 31st Annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. This lectureship was started in 1989 by Dr. Stephen Lefrak at the Jewish Hospital of St. Louis. And really, its job is to examine medical transgressions and collaboration, as well as medical resistance to the policies of National Socialism in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Today's speaker is Dr. Stephen Lefrak, and during his 45 years on faculty at Washington University, there's no other way to describe Stephen but as a force like no other. He had multiple jobs and titles, including the director of the residency program at the Jewish Hospital of St. Louis. He was assistant dean and director of the humanities program at the medical center. He was the founding director of the medical intensive care unit at Jewish Hospital, founded the lung volume reduction program at the Jacqueline Maritz Lung Center, and served many roles as historian, ethicist, but most of all, Stephen was a patient advocate and a master clinician. If you were sick in this institution, you wanted Stephen Lefrak taking care of you. He always put patients first and still cares about patients. With the onset of the pandemic in March, one of the first calls I got was from Stephen asking how he can help. Stephen is a master clinician, wonderful friend, and a great advocate for patients. I'll turn the mic over to him now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rosenbluth. Thank you very much, Dr. Frazier. Nothing is ever done alone. I've had tremendous support and help in doing this. We've gone through the years with I think may have, if we can get one, a list of all those speakers, ranging from almost perpetrators to those who were survivors and some of our own doctors. My point today is to deal with what I think has become a voice that is not heard. And I'm not sure I am the one or I can represent the victim's voice. But the story that has somehow gotten lost here in the past 31 years is the voice of the truly heroic doctors and nurses and pharmacists of the Jewish community locked in ghettos, facing a fate the same as their patients, which meant death, and yet who showed up for work every day, wearing, as you can see, their white coats, and in this case, yellow stars. In the Warsaw Ghetto, they wore blue stars. Always a threat to being shot, killed, murdered, raped by an Estonian SS man or some other German functionary who was bored with his time and would pick on someone going to work. I think it's a good story to tell, and it's a story that illustrates many things that we should be paying attention to as we go along. These doctors healed, trying to preserve life in the land of death. They worked knowing that their fate would undoubtedly be the same as the patients, but each day they always chose life, remembering the eternal truthfulness of their medical training and Jewish tradition. And so we will go through this. Let me just give you a brief and quick look at my goals. Is it going through? No, it's not moving. At any rate, my goals don't have to have a slide for, but maybe we can get the slides moving, because we certainly will need them for other things. So my goals are, first of all, to present a snapshot of medicine in an extremely extraordinary, thank you. Will it work now?
Yes.
In an extremely extraordinary era. I'd like to give voice, as I said, to their victims by remembering them, if not all by name, which of course is impossible, but at least by deed. And most importantly, I'd like to raise questions for your thought and discussion. We are having a discussion group at 12:30 this afternoon by Zoom. If you wish to join, we'd be glad to have you. If not, think about these sorts of thoughts. That is human life of unqualified value? Is all life? What values, if any, may be applied to the contingencies of human life if we think it's contingent? On what values would that depend? Should the state, the government, parties, or other agencies assign value to human life? In a fiduciary medical relationship, which we teach our students we have, that is a trusting relationship between patient and physician, where the patient's interest precedes the physician's interest, supersedes, if you will, is perhaps a better word. What determines the patient's interest that supersedes the caregiver's interest? How far beyond pure medical things might that occur? And what are pure medical things? And of course, always, why the Jews? Why any group? And most importantly, what I'm most upset by, I would say, although as Danny and Dr. Fraser will tell you, I do get upset rather easily. The use of the word Nazi has certainly permeated our political dialogue. It's used everyone from commentators on CNN to leading legislatures of the Democratic House. I don't know if they really understand what they're saying. Are they demeaning not just Nazi, but are they demeaning the victims of Nazism by just lowering it to some base level? So let's begin this way. And this is what I always feared, even before I started this, that it was really important to keep this in mind, that no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. No statement about the Shoah, including Nazis, should be made that is not credible in the presence of 1.5 million burning Jewish children. And that statement was made by Rabbi Greenberg, who, interestingly enough, in age 87 this year, had just taken a new job at Jerusalem. But the statement's really important. And we should be very careful about our rhetoric and how we use it. So let's begin just briefly so you'll understand where the word Nazi comes from and what it stands for. And Nazi comes from the German pronunciation of the name of their political party, which was the National Socialist Deutsches Arbeiter Party, the German Socialist, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. But in German, national is pronounced national, national, and that's where the abbreviation Nazi comes from. And this was a revolutionary party which was basically seeking new origins for Germany, to change Germany's past history, to break it free of the isms of the past, not just the isms of Weimar, such as Marxism, communism, socialism, socialism, Leninism. We can go through all of those, but more importantly, Judaism. National Socialism saw Judaism interlinked with the history of Germany, and particularly with Protestant and Christianity in Germany. The Protestant ministers, by and large, agreed. There's no doubt that National Socialism was racist and violent in its worldview, but most importantly, overwhelmingly, to its very depths and heart, radical anti-Semitism was at the very basis. Its vision was of a world without Jews. National Socialism understand what they called the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, as one of cosmic importance. The Jew was the eternal existential threat. And if you have an eternal existential threat, you're allowed to do almost anything to protect yourself. Every act by the National Socialist Germans against the Jews is caged in a mechanism of self-defense. We must defend ourselves from these terribly strong, aggressive people After all, these are the people, these Jews killed God. What else couldn't they do? Unlike their Untermenschen, their lower people, the Slavs and the Poles and Lithuanians and Russians, who really couldn't do much. And most importantly, when the Germans put out their new plan for the East, that is, as they took over the eastern part from Poland East, there was always a certain number of Poles, a certain number of Lithuanians presented. There would be 25,000, 250,000 of these to serve the Germans. There were no Jews. Europe was to be combed from the Atlantic to the Urals. Every Jew found, every Jew sent away. The new origins for Germany were to separate Christian Germany from its Jewish roots. The Jewish roots, of course, are that Jesus is a Jew, the Messiah is a Jew, that Christianity is based on the Hebrew scriptures, and this was found to be intolerable and needed a new origin. How could you give the Jews the original moral forefront with the Ten Commandments? It had to be changed. And it was changed in such a way that that moral strength of what was in the Hebrew scriptures became really an anti-moral strength, and strength was in the Aryan and in Jesus as an Aryan. In addition, they carried on the National Socialists, the biological eugenic social Darwinism, which was very prevalent in the Kaiserreich, and the Weimar Republic enthusiastically adopted it, used it, and sometimes used it as a cover. But as you'll see, it doesn't cover everything, and it's a real reach for some of it. Let's begin, since we all know how it ends anyway, at Treblinka. Treblinka was one of a Vernichtungslager. This is a Polish monument at Treblinka, where somewhere between 750 and 900,000 Jews were burnt and cremated. There's only one of three, and the Polish caption reads, this was a Hitler death camp. The Poles are very sensitive, of course. They want to make sure they know it's not a Polish death camp, but that this was a German death camp. And the first commandant of Treblinka was a psychiatrist, a German psychiatrist, Imfried Eberl, who came from the Tiergartenstrasse 4 program, the euthanasia program, which eliminated the mentally ill and others, and killed about 70,000 Germans, irregardless of race or religion, to free up hospital beds. And that's where it began. The contrast, he lasted a short time as the commandant of Auschwitz. He was very good at gassing people. He wasn't so efficient at burning bodies, but that was quickly corrected. And here is a broader picture of Treblinka. The large monument that you can see standing there represents the outside of the camp. And you see all these small stones with some atzavot, which represent monuments of gravestones of Jews. There are several of those gravestones that are engraved. There's only one person who has his name on a gravestone. There's some towns that were destroyed, but the one person who has his name on a gravestone is Janusz Goldschmidt, which was his pen name. Henrik Goldschmidt, his real name. If you can read that, it's Janusz Goldschmidt with his children. Janusz Goldschmidt was a pediatrician who came back to Warsaw when Germany invaded it from Palestine. Took over his orphanage, moved his orphanage to the ghetto. And because he was convinced that his children, and it probably was true, would be so hysterical when they were pushed on the trains to Treblinka, his ultimate act of fidelity to his patients was to go with his children so they could be calm as long as they could be. And we'll talk about this later. That for me, though, has always been a bar. It's the highest bar that I couldn't reach, but at least I knew it existed for some. And in point of fact, Gottschalk was not the only Jewish doctor there, but we don't know all their names, and so Gottschalk was picked as a symbol for all that. The population of Poland pre-war was about 36 million, 10% of which were Jews, so about 3.6 million. There were about 300,000 Jews left that could be identified at the end of the Second World War. I think it's good to contrast Ebel and Korczak's existing etchings. Korczak was really in the Jewish tradition. Doesn't matter whether he was a religious Jew or not, but there was this Jewish tradition. Ebel, of course, was in the National Socialist or other secular tradition. And these are two polar opposites in dealing with patients. Korczak thought that all human life was of intrinsic, equal, and infinite worth. Ebel, not so much. Now, if you wish to have a metaphor of a single ancestor, that is Adam, either a metaphor or you really believe it is what that is, the important thing there is that, therefore, if we're all from Adam, no one's forebears are better than another's. There are no races. We all from the same. We all are one. Ebel, on the other hand, believed that human life was contingent upon values other than human's life's value alone. There's no infinite love, no human value in human life. Those values were determined by either racial myth, science, or need to the community. For Korczak, the foremost task of medicine is to preserve life since it's of infinite worth. There is no outside value scale of race, age, merit, talent, qualities to decide which life is worth more than any other life. One cannot choose once one's beyond the medical issues, individual life. On the other hand, Ebel and the National Socialists and others now in the secular world believe the task of medicine is to further the health of the folk, the genes, the blood, the people, not individuals. We hear it sometimes expressed as humanity. The physician in the Jewish tradition is the fiduciary of the individual patient. He puts that patient's interest before his. The question, of course, is how far do those interests go? The physician in the National Socialist tradition is really the fiduciary of the state or of the government. In the National Socialist state and government were almost identical. So the patient is to be treated as one part of a much larger whole of unity, his race or his folk. The National Socialist program was implemented immediately upon election to the plurality in its Reichstag in 1933. There were increasing attacks upon Jews. They were sort of isolated, but they were going on all the way through Germany. There was a restricted apartheid-like system where Jews were not allowed into stores until certain hours, sit on park benches. Throughout cities and villages, Germans had signs up, "We don't want these Jews." Increasing numbers with Jews as time went on. Every university faculty, the professions, public institutions, for instance, orchestras, were all cleansed of Jews. Businesses, Jewish businesses were boycotted and destroyed. Synagogues were destroyed kind of an ad lib basis. In 1935, Wilhelm Frick helped pass the Nuremberg laws, which defined a Jew as he who had one grandfather. It wasn't defined on religious grounds. And if that, you were excluded from the Volksgemeinschaft, the German community, the Aryan community. Jews were gradually thrown out of the professions, their place limited, their citizenship taken away. They no longer were German citizens. They were just people who lived in Germany and were at the stake of the state. In 1936, as the Olympics came to Germany, there was a calming down, at least on the surface of this, so that Europeans didn't think it was so bad, nor Americans. Sort of interesting that when the French Olympic team marched into the Olympic Stadium in 1936, it raised its right arm in the Hitler salute. 1938, now we've had 5 years of a constant onslaught of anti-Jewish, as well as other things, but predominantly this anti-Jewish onslaught of propaganda, of acts. And Germany was riding very high. Germany under National Socialism had gone from a sort of a second-rate country to one of the leading European powers. It has by itself peacefully destroyed the Versailles Treaty. It was armed. It had regained the Saarland and the Rhineland in the west. Anschluss with Austria was accomplished and accompanied by great joy in Austria. Of course, the Jews paid a heavy price for that as well. There was reunification with the German-speaking Czech Sudetenland. I use reunification in quotes, where the French and the British basically sold the Sudetenland to the Germans and made Czechoslovakia open to a total takeover by Germany. And now, in the month of November, but in 1938, what was called Kristallnacht, for all the glass on the stone. Nobody knows. I looked up, who called Kristallnacht Kristallnacht? And it's really unclear. I couldn't find whether that was the Nazis, the Jews, the people who lived there. And very recently, the name has been changed to the November Pogrom for good reasons, because it wasn't just about breaking glass. It was a road to showing the German people a world without Jews. It was the German government feeling very powerful that they could act out against the Jews and finally rid themselves of these Jews, attain a world without Jews. And all they needed was an excuse. And the excuse was a poor, disturbed young man whose parents were put on an island between Germany and Poland, and nobody wanted them, and they died. And this man went to the Paris consulate and shot von Rath, who was a low-ranking member of the German delegation, killed it. And this was an organized, supposedly, revenge against that, led by Muller of the Gestapo and Reinhardt of the security services. And this was Kristallnacht. 1,400 synagogues burned throughout Germany. Not just Germany, as we're used to thinking, but all of Germany. I don't know if I have a pointer on it, doesn't matter, but you can see the little dots here. It's all of Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. And you may say to yourself, why burn synagogues? Why get rid of these monuments of synagogues that have been there? Some for almost 1,000 years. And the answer was the Nazis wanted to separate Judaism from German background. Nazism was as much about a new origin for the German people, a new way of being founded, as it was about going forward. In addition, each synagogue contains at least 2, and sometimes 3 to 5 Torah scrolls, the Hebrew scriptures. And the Hebrew scriptures, of course, are the sense of morality that the Jews had, and which may have given birth to Jesus. The Germans found that as well intolerable. And by burning the scrolls, by burning the Jewish alliance with morality, Jesus became an Aryan who was only Judaicized by Paul. And this sort of idea didn't just come with the Nazis. This idea had been potting around with the Protestant Christian church in Germany for a long time. And this is a picture outside a synagogue about to be burnt. I think you can read the sign. The sign says, "This is in revenge for the death of von Rath, death to international Judaism and Freemasonry." There's several two important things that you should see here. Number one are the eternal lights that are always around the Torah scroll. They're on the heap to be burned. And most importantly, I don't know if I have a pointer here or not. I guess I don't. Most importantly, the 10 Commandments, which you see on, which are present in most synagogues, which Moses brought down by story from Mount Sinai. But the first commandment on the right is Ani Ad Hashem, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have any gods before me, is number 2. And you read those going down, and then you begin on the next, up there on the top. Number 6 is thou shalt not commit murder. But you also can read to the right to left, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not murder. And this was also anathema to the Germans. This also had to be destroyed because murder was certainly part of their program. They did not want the Jews to have any kind of historical attachment to morality. They did not want the synagogues, which grew up in Germany and was intertwined with German buildings and German history and German towns. All of that was to be destroyed, and it was done pretty successfully. And really the message that was being given out, if you think this was all racial science, if you think that the Nazi attack on Jews was based on racial science, on that kind of thing, why in the world attack religious symbols? There's nothing scientific about the Torahs. You could argue about that's a problem I don't want to get into. But there's nothing scientific about the synagogues. They're just buildings, memorials, monuments that stood for years. No, what they wanted to do was destroy any link between Germany and Jewish identity. So it would be clearly distinct and apart. And the last day, German men were rounded up in many towns, about 60,000 in total. Some of them roped. And you can see these very proud SS men, so proud of what they were doing, marching these Jews off to concentration camps, mostly Sachsenhausen in Berlin and Dachau in the south, near Munich. And the signs vary. This is a big sign on a Jewish star saying, God forgive us, in this case. Others would say exodus of the Jews. But the message, what was delivered, was very clear. A world without Jews was possible. They could get them out in some way and not have to be involved with Jews or Judaism. And if the Jews weren't God's chosen people, which they certainly were not, Nazis adopted the Christian idea of Jews as being Satan, pretty much. And who were the God-chosen people? It was pretty obvious. The Germans were God's chosen people. And thus in 1938, Germany reached an ascendancy that it was not to come down to for many years. In the rest of that year, Germany moved to gaining Lebensraum. It was always a cry, we need more land, we need more land. And so in 1939, Molotov and Ribbentrop signed a non-aggression pact. Interesting enough, Molotov representing an international socialist nation, the USSR, and Ribbentrop representing a national socialist nation, Nazi Germany. And that peace agreement was signed, but it was more than that. It said who was going to divide what in Poland and in the Baltics. And on September 1st, 1939, Germany and USSR moved in with their troops. You can see the Germans moved as far as the Bug River here. I don't know how to show this on them. Is there a pointer? No, I don't know. It's okay. People should be able to see it. I don't know how to make the thing point. There's no.
Yeah, is there a big screen, Steve? When you do the.
I see something. There you go. There you go. Okay, then I just got my hand to work. That's another story. I think this is not going to be well. Here you go. There's the Bug River. This here going up, dividing German-occupied Poland from the Soviet Union-occupied Poland, and also this is a little out of place actually for some reason. But anyway, Germany founded the general government, which became a dumping ground for Jews, and the Russians or the Soviets founded the Ukrainian SSR, the Lithuanian, the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republics, and those two nations faced each other until Hitler felt comfortable by taking out the French and other Western powers, and then could move in 1941 against the Soviet Union and eventually wipe all that out, moving east of the general government of Poland, taking over all of as much land as it can grab and moving all the way to the gates of Moscow. As Germany moved into Poland, ghettos were built. And I always thought, well, they just built ghettos. I mean, there was a central order, but it's not so clear. It's amazing what you learn from doing things like this. And here's Heydrich, who was the one giving the order, and he wrote on September 21st, there was this meeting, we have no minutes. Heydrich decided that there would be these instructions, the solution of the Jewish question, sent to his Einsatzgruppen, was a planned comprehensive measure which was secret and couldn't be revealed yet, but there were short-term stages. It's only the short-term stages that he dealt with in the Schnell brief. And the first was, for the time being, the first prerequisite for the final aim is the concentration of the Jew from the countryside into the largest cities. Not into a ghetto, but just put them into the largest cities. It doesn't say anything more than that. This is to be carried out speedily. Number two, a council of Jewish elders was to be formed in every one of these communities, which was to be made up as much as possible of authoritative personalities and rabbis. But this is important. The council is to be made fully responsible in the literal sense of the word for the exact and prompt implementation of directives already issued or issued in the future. So basically, the Judenrat had little to say. It was to serve as a place where the Germans could give orders, and the Judenrat better deliver those orders to the Jewish community and have them carried out. Because if not, in case of sabotage of such instructors, the councils are to be warned that the most severe measures would be taken, which usually meant shooting of the councils or shooting of others. But the German solution was always, if you don't do what I say, I will kill you. And here are the ghettos in the East. In 1942, you can see most of the ghettos are in where the general government was in Poland. You can see where, oops, I don't know, I'll leave that out. And, oh, wait a second, I think, I remember right, there you go. Finally, the old memory comes back. Interestingly enough, here is Minsk, up in Belarus. This was Pinsk, ghetto in Pinsk, where my mother's family was killed in 2 days when the 2nd SS Cavalry Brigade killed 30,000 Jews. Kiev, you know, was Baba Yar. In a weekend, 32,000 Jews shot. These were all being shot. These were all ghettos. Notice that there is no ghetto in Hungary, which had a very large population. And the reason there was no ghetto in Hungary was that Hungary was an ally of Germany and was fighting with Germany. And we're going to jump ahead a little bit, so try to concentrate on the time jump from 42 to 44, when after Stalingrad, the Hungarians realized Hitler's going to lose the war. And it's time to try to get out with what we can get out. And they try making peace with the Allies. Of course, that was probably not a wise choice. But the Germans took over Hungary completely. They sent in their troops for maybe several reasons. One, to keep Hungary as an ally, but perhaps more importantly, in their major quest to destroy all Jews. Hungary was the last great concentration of Jews in Europe. There were 950,000 Jews in Hungary. When the German army moved in, appointed the Hungarian gendarmerie to round up all the Jews and place them in ghettos. This is our much beloved and Gus Schoenfeld, who was our director of medicine and a friend, of course, who was in one of these ghettos in Hungary with his family. The ghetto is in Munkacs, which was his hometown and was located in a brick factory. These ghettos didn't last very long. There were 145 trains that were sent periodically at a very rapid rate that deported 450,000 of these Jews to Auschwitz, where they all were almost all destroyed, gassed and burned. Gus, his father, his little brother, and his grandmother were on one of those transports. Gus's grandmother and his little brother went on the first night to the gas chambers in the crematoria. Gus and his father managed to get through to the male camp, as did the mother, and as you know, they survived the war, barely. But the ghetto administrations were so different. They were very local because they just all make a ghetto. Okay, so there was fighting, constant fighting in the administration between the SS and local German administration and others about planning and policy. Should we have the ghetto work? Should we have them make clothes? The ghetto people, many of them, the administrators, were open to bribery, thank God. There were inconsistencies and conflicts and policy changes, so you can't make general statements. You need to have various quality throughout all these because there were various people, and frankly, it's a job I don't think anybody really wanted. These ghettos were constructed in the worst parts of the cities with already marked overcrowding, inadequate hygiene and health facilities. But most importantly, everyone, German, Poles, and others thought these were temporary measures. They all would go away. The Germans were told by Heydrich they were temporary. The Jews prayed the war would end, and they'd been through stuff like this before, and the war would end and they would be free. And the Poles thought, well, the Jews hopefully will go away one way or another. They all had severely restricted access to food, and there was universal starvation throughout this country, this general government. Poles received 600 kilocalories per day, Jews about 130 to 300 kilocalories per day. The League of Nations said you needed about 2,400 calories per day to survive, so they were all starving. Starving, crowding led to epidemics of typhus, typhoid, and of course, most feared tuberculosis. Some of the ghettos were sealed eventually. Some were used as sites of war production for the Germans, that is rescue through work, and led the Jews to believe, well, the Germans can't kill us, they need us for work. No, they didn't realize the Germans didn't need the Jews at all or want them. All of them, though, however, resisted the German death machine. Physicians, nurses, pharmacists, public health all worked to save Jewish lives and confound German wishes. Many of the ghettos themselves had armed uprisings. You're all familiar with the Warsaw Ghetto, but Białystok, Krakow, and others had armed uprising. Almost all the ghettos were liquidated by 1942 and early 43, and soon all were. Just to give you an idea how what the population density was, St. Louis population density is about 5,000 people per square mile. The city of Warsaw about 13,000 per square mile. The Warsaw Ghetto about a little over 300,000 per square mile. When the Germans concentrated more than 400,000 Jews in an area of 1.3 square miles, they created a biological time bomb of epidemic and death. You had 9 Jews living in a room, not 9 Jews living in a bedroom, not 9 Jews living in an apartment, 9 Jews living in a single room. In the summer of 1941, Willy George, an older German soldier, got permission to take his Leica camera and take pictures in the ghetto. And these pictures were interesting. He took them. You can see here they are furtively. These are Jews, how crowded it is. They all have their hats off. That was the order. No matter what the rank of the soldier, your hat came off. And they were looking at him very attentively and worriedly. Another place is this market here, where you can see how thin and terrible everybody looks. Some of the kids, of course, are told to smile and do smile. You can look at the food there on the bottom. That was for sale, which was not very, shall we say, appetizing. And but Willy George also had an eye for women, I suppose. And going forward here. There she is. Here's a woman wearing her white and blue armband, but looking at least somewhat made up, doing something, I don't know what. What's interesting is that this is the last picture that we have. And you can see, if you look carefully through these archways, there's a woman marching along with 6 little Jewish kids, either going to school or to class or to something. But Willy George, when he came out of the ghetto, the SS said, well, what's in that camera? Give me the camera. I think he really wanted the Leica. He took the Leica with 1 roll of film, but didn't search Willy George, who had 4 rolls of film still in his pocket. He developed them, printed them, and kept them locked away for 50 years. And finally, talking to someone, he eventually published them with someone who was interested in this particular problem. So I suspect he was ashamed, and there was this shame, but at least we have a record of what the ghetto looked like. At the same time, in October of 41, there was a meeting of 100 German physicians from the general government to decide what to do with the Jews in controlling epidemics. And Jost Walbaum, who was the head epidemiologist for the general government, responded, why don't we just feed them, the Germans? Some of the German physicians said, feed them, give them some clothes, and we won't have to worry about typhus. And he responded, you are completely right. Naturally, this is a doctor, remember. Naturally, it'd be best and simplest to give the people sufficient provisions, but that cannot be done. This is connected to the food situation, to the war situation in general. Thus, shooting will be employed when one comes across a Jew outside the ghetto without permission. There are only two ways. We sentence the Jews to death by hunger, or we shoot them. Even if the end result, this is a physician, even if the end result is the same, the latter is more intimidating. We cannot do otherwise. We have only one responsibility. The responsibility of the German physician was to care for the folk. Only one responsibility is that the German people are not infected and endangered by these parasites. For that, any means must be right. And signs were pasted all over that looked like this. Here's an obvious Jewish caricature with a large louse. And it reads in Polish, Jews are lice, they cause typhus. So the Jew is the parasite, he's the lice, he is the typhus itself. Stay away. And on every ghetto that was put up was a sign in German that says, Achtung, epidemic area, entrance or access really forbidden. Sounds a little bit like a special lockdown. Let us jump ahead to the Vilna Ghetto. And here's a picture of Dan Schuster, our ex-colleague's father, who was caught up in Vilna. He was born in Vilna. He worked in Vilna. One of his brothers was evacuated when, remember, I said the Baltics were taken over by the Soviet Union, and then as the Germans came, the Soviets pulled back. So one of Bear's brothers evacuated Vilna with the Soviet army and was never heard from again, probably served and died perhaps in the war. Two ghettos were established after Vilna was occupied by the Germans, the old Jewish quarter on September 6, 1941. Before that, 6,000 Jews were liquidated without ghettoization by the local Lithuanians and Poles, and the Germans had to put a stop to that to make sure that things went orderly. Bear's father and brother, that is Dan's grandfather and his uncle, were killed by the Germans. And the criteria for getting into ghettos was fitness for labor. This became a standard all over Europe. Ghetto number 1, 30,000 Jews. Those are the ones who were most fit for labor. Ghetto 2, 11,000 Jews, the older, the younger, the frailest, the sickest, who would soon be liquidated in Ponari in a few weeks. The Jews had less than an hour to get going before they were herded into the ghetto. And of course, personal hygiene was markedly adversely affected by a limited money. There was no medicine, clean clothes, soap towels, very limited supplies of wood and coal for heating in the freezing cold of the winter. They were extremely crowded, as we said, not as bad as Warsaw, but the population density increased 7 to 10 times. Old sewer systems, barely adequate pre-war, were overwhelmed. Most outdoor housing complexes had privies with 2 to 4 seats intended for 1/10 the population. The water system was inadequate, and waste removal, was not allowed, and excrement and waste piled up as high as second floor windows. The medical response to this was fast and quick, in part because the Vilna doctors were quite good. Vilna was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, and it included medicine as well as other forms of study. So they had doctors. There were 850 doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's about 150 doctors in the Vilna Ghetto. Weeks before the ghetto, the Jewish doctors met to plan for a public health and extremists and came up with a general plan to deal with this. Maybe as a gift to General Jens, who was a Jewish army officer in the Lithuanian army, the Germans allowed the Jewish hospital to be in the ghetto area. 130 Jewish doctors created and organized a place which they called healing, sanitary and epidemiological section, and childcare. We'll do this briefly. Healing, of course, was a hospital, ambulatory clinics, and a pharmacy. They had a sanitary epidemiological section, which provided prophylaxis, laundries, vaccinations, anti-insect brigades, garbage removal, and childcare, such as milk kitchens and children's things. A pharmacist who was in the ghetto wrote after the war, he called his book, it was published in Yiddish, Starke von Eisen, strong from iron. You could call him the Iron Man, but whatever. All ghetto institutions were created to save Jews or to ease their fate. Every department was a battle station, but the hospital was exceptional. It was a defensive line, a true resistance movement that fought not with arms, not with guns and grenades, but with knowledge and with self-sacrifice to snatch as many lives as possible from German hands. And it worked within the limits that the Germans allowed it to work. Nutritional support was provided by building of tea houses, which really were providing hot water where people could line up with their teapots, carry hot water back to their houses for cooking and for cleaning and for other purposes. They were in charge of food smuggling and redistribution of the smuggled food, so it was somewhat fairly redistributed so people had something to eat. Soup kitchens were built, and they learned how to manufacture vitamin B, and they learned how to extract calcium and phosphorus from horses' bones, dead horses' bones, so they could give their children these kinds of supplements to keep their bones growing as strong as possible. Sanitation improved, trash disposal, and mostly they made an agreement with the non-Jewish peasants in the area that they would take for free the waste and excrement removed and take it to their homes and use it. They used the waste, which was mostly potato peels, to feed their cows, and they used their excrement as manure for fertilizer. There were inspections carried out by the Jewish sanitary police on all homes and on people and how clean they were and how they were following the laws. Barbers were employed to cut hair and beards with rabbinical sanctions because everybody knew that hair was where lice love to hang out, and the less hair, the less lice. And then there was, of course, prevention and containment of contagious diseases, a major issue, where there were mass immunizations were carried out. The Germans were so afraid of fever, spotted fever, typhus, that they provided vaccinations material to the Jews. And the Jews, of course, got it, and they were a little bit worried. How do we trust the Germans? So they tried it first on dogs. And if the dogs didn't die, they then gave them to people, and it seemingly did work. 22,000 were immunized out of 30,000 by 1942. Quarantine stations were built to take the people who came in from work camps, quarantine them, make sure they did not have disease before they were allowed into the ghetto. However, on the 2nd and 24th of September 1943, the Vilna Ghetto was liquidated by the SS and Estonian SS helpers. Most of the people were sent who could work, were sent to other Arbeitslagers, work camps, which is where Bear Schuster went. The rest were taken to Konari and killed. Let us return to Warsaw, where medicine saw the face of a German onslaught. The Germans had destroyed every medical establishment outside the ghetto, and the Jews had to rebuild a whole medical system. The Chisty, which was known as the Orthodox Jew Hospital, was reestablished back into the ghetto. That hospital is one of the more famous hospitals in all of Poland. It was well equipped, which of course the Germans took all the equipment. It had 1,200 beds. People came from all over Poland to be treated there. To re-equip their hospital, there were people who knew how to steal on the Aryan side, and they were given lists of what things they should go into hospitals, look for. Quite a task to give someone who doesn't know anything about X-ray equipment or anything. Please get this, get that, bring it back if you can. And they did. They succeeded in reestablishing a hospital. Nowhere near like the original, but at least a functioning hospital. The Burson and Bauman Children's Hospital was in the ghetto location and existed from 1817 to 1943. I will talk about the nursing school, which continued, which was of critical importance. And then there were ghetto medical clinics set up, of course, with ambulatory clinical care and quarantine stations and children's clinics. A clandestine medical school was founded, whose graduates eventually practiced, some of them, the ones that survived in Poland, Israel, and the USA, and they published, the doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, a clinical research study on hunger disease, clinical research on hunger carried out in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. This effort was led by Dr. Milikowski, who was the director of that. The Jewish nursing school deserves special mention. The Jewish nurses were at the forefront of saving lives, of fighting and taking their lives in their hands every time they walked in the street to go to the hospital. to go to their nursing school, they were open to being shot, to being raped, to being whatever the local Estonian felt like doing if he was having a bad day. The hospital itself had been organized in 1923 by Warsaw Jews, the community itself of Warsaw, and the American Joint Distribution Committee, which kept Poland alive for a long time. There's a charity in the United States known as the Joint, and everybody who grew up in that time knew the Joint and appreciated the Joint. The first director was Amelia Greenwald, who was a registered nurse, served in the First World War in the U.S. Army, and from 1923 to 1939, this nursing school graduated 23 classes with 240 well-trained nurses. In 1939 to 1943, because Greenwald went to the United States to raise money with the Joint, Lubabelka Blum, diploma number 10 from the nursing school, became its director. In October 1940, as the ghetto went up, that school and the 1,200-bed hospital, which was on Sister Street outside the ghetto, was destroyed. They all had to move in and rebuild it. In January 41, the school reopened again in relation to the Bauman Hospital, with Dr. Browder Heller in charge of the Bauman Hospital. So medical care in the Warsaw Ghetto was basically led by two women. One, the nursing school director, Lubella Blum, and two, the hospital director, Browder Heller. The schools and nurses focused obviously on epidemic disease, particularly typhoid and typhus. And before a patient was admitted, well, it sounds simple. They bathed all patients, shaved them, deloused them, got them clean clothes. That was a major task and a major advance. It kept the hospital free of disease. In August 6th of 1942, we're coming to the end of the Warsaw Ghetto. The Bauman School was liquidated, and the nursing school was designated as Schwesterheim, a sister's home for nurses. And on August 18th, the last class graduated students from the 25th class. And on January 19th, 1943, the SS, particularly Estonian SS mostly, entered, killed all patients, nurses, and doctors at their workplaces. And as a reward, were given a liter of vodka per patient killed in bed. Only 2 Jewish nurses survived. Mrs. Shesheveska, who was designated an Arisheshenheit, a Aryan beauty. I guess I don't have a picture of her. I guess she was blonde. And I don't know what happened to her. She may not have survived the war. And Miss Sabina Zenderman was called a Yiddisheshenheit, a Jewish beauty for her dark hair, etc. But she was an attractive woman who managed to survive Auschwitz and came to the United States after the war. 12% of all graduates of the nursing home survived World War II, in which 97% of the Jews of Poland died. In 1965, about time, that great friend of the Jews, the International Red Cross awarded the Florence Nightingale Medal to Lubabelka Blum. The clandestine medical school opened in May 41 and lasted until July 42. It hit as a vocational course. The Jews had convinced the Germans that they needed a vocational courses for various purposes, and they convinced them they needed a sanitary course for fighting epidemics. Anything that fought epidemics found the heart of the Germans very quickly. Julius Zweibaum actually was the head of the first years of basic medical education. It was like a European school. Pre-war, he'd been a docent at the University of Warsaw Medical School. A docent is a rank of associate professor, which was high as a Jew could get in the Warsaw Medical School. Dr. Ludwig Hertzfeld, the well-known blood type man, developed a superior course for 4th and 5th year students. The Germans expected a short course of epidemic techniques, which was used as cover for the medical school for 14 months. The school was outside the ghetto until they had built a bridge, a wooden bridge, to get from the ghetto to the medical school. And the guards amused themselves on the patients as they went by. The guards were usually Polish, who were the worst, the blue police, the Germans, and of course there were Jewish police there as well. And amusement meant anywhere from kicking, beating, shooting, and raping. The story about anatomy was sort of typical in way Dr. humor, but shows you how dehumanized the ghetto had become. Bodies were plentiful, preservatives were not. Therefore, died yesterday, dissected today. Sounds terrible. So Dr. humor, perhaps, dehumanized would be a better way to put it. The clinical work, of course, that they learned was carried out in the hospitals of the ghetto, and few of these students managed to survive the deportation to the ghetto. The ghettos ended achieving a world without Jews between 1942 and 43, based on several reasons. There was a failure. Am I out of time? Not quite. Failure of immigration plans. There were actual plans to send the Jews from Poland to the Soviet Union. That failed when they went to war with the Soviet Union. And the RSHA actually discussed sending them, since Vichy was now a French government. They owned Madagascar, a French colony off the coast of Africa, to load all the Jews of Europe on ships and send them to Madagascar and dump them off into the jungle. That plan ended when Britain held out in the Battle of Britain and maintained control of the sea lanes. And the burden on the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union was, according to him, terrible. These men really were having trouble shooting. It's all shot 1 million people. Many of them Jews, all of them Jews, most of them Jews, correction, but many of them children and mothers. Most of them ended up getting drunk, using drugs. They were no longer fit for action, and Himmler decided he needed a more humane way to kill. In addition, Hitler was ecstatic at the way the war's success was proceeding in the East, and he was enraged when he found out there were still Jews in Berlin, demanded the Jews from Berlin be exported or deported to the East, send them to the general government. The people in general government said, we have no place to put them. He said, empty, someone can make room. At the same time, T4, Tiergartenstrasse 4 euthanasia, had killed 70,000 people in Germany, which was the plan to get rid of those people with mental disease and other diseases by gas. And it reached its goal. It demonstrated it was successful killing by carbon monoxide could be carried out technically, and it was politically acceptable by the Germans, and the Germans didn't raise heck about killing their relatives. Why would they raise heck about killing Jews? The Wannsee Conference, good old Apple spelling, was held in January 42, which organized the bureaucracy to carry out what was called Action Reinhardt. This included the T4, who about 150 were moved to Poland, the Order Police, who were about 150,000 German police who were militarized, the Trawaniki Hiwis, they were people, Estonians, Lithuanians, who had volunteered for service in the SS, and they numbered another 150,000, so the Germans had about 300,000 armed people to carry out emptying of the ghettos without affecting armed troops fighting. And the Reichsbahn, the railroad, was at their disposal. In 11 months, almost 3 million Jewish Poles were killed in rapid time and no end. The great action and destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto began July 23rd on Tisha B'Av. Germans were very good at picking Jewish memorial days. Tisha B'Av was the day we mourned the destruction of the two temples, so the Rosh action begins then and ended on Yom Kippur, September 21st, 1942. Deportation from Warsaw, and it's went on from other towns, 2 trains a day, 6,000 Jews per train. Get your mind around that. 6,000 Jews back and not home. Treblinka, gassed and burnt. Hilsviga were predominantly from Estonia and Latvia, helped load the trains along with the Order Police in Germany. On September 11th, 1942, the day of Rosh Hashanah, the sick and most of the hospital staff, about 1,000 in Warsaw, were deported to Treblinka. Adina Blady Schrager, I advise you to read her book, gave a group of children who she'd been caring for morphine so that they could die in peace in the hospital and not undergo the transition and the horrors of a train ride to Treblinka. She never forgot that. She never came to peace with that. It's actually against the tradition of Jewish doctors to kill patients, but she didn't know even then whether she had done the right thing. The Ghetto Uprising occurred on April 43 on the evening of Passover by the Qatar and ZOB. And of course, it was, depending on one's viewpoint, unsuccessful militarily, successful in other ways. And the ghetto was declared liquidated by General Stroop in 1943. I'm going to finish. I'm going to run over because I want to just get hunger Krankheit in here, which was this study by the Jewish doctors of hunger disease in the ghetto. And I put it in Yiddish, although it was in every other languages, because I think Yiddish is a language that deserves he lived. So it's Hungerkrankheit, the collective Arbeit von jüdischen Doktoren in Warschauer Ghetto. That is hunger disease, the collective work of the Jewish doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto. There were 22 collaborating Jewish physicians. Everyone knew that his work could be interrupted suddenly, individually, death, his own or his patients, or by mass deportations. Everyone knew that his work anyway was likely to conclude in death. As the approaching crisis and deportations grew worse, it became clear that the manuscript must be removed from the ghetto while there was still yet time. It was delivered to Dr. Witold Orlowski, who was very helpful at the Jewish Medical School. He was a non-Jew who still taught at the Warsaw Medical School, at the professor of internal medicine at the University of Warsaw. None of the 22 collaborating physicians survived the war. Only one physician is still alive after the Battle of the Ghetto. Dr. Applebaum died in January as a result of his experience. This is what Dr. Israel Milikovsky, sort of the force behind this, director of the health department in the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote as an introduction. The subject of our study is the usual day-to-day hunger, hunger in the physical sense. From this point of view, we, the Jews, are outside the fence of competition, especially now. We are honored to encase this subject in a scientific problem to satisfy our hunger for science and to gain knowledge at the expense of our physical hunger. If the discussion is from a historical viewpoint, then this is truly the unfinished symphony of Jewish physicians from 1942. And his daughter had already been deported to Treblinka, and he wrote a brief zecher in memory to her in the book as well. But it was more to us, as you can see, to a last few words to honor you, the Jewish doctors. What can I tell you, my beloved colleagues, and they are our colleagues as well, and companions in misery, you are part of all of us. Slavery, hunger, deportation, those death figures in our ghettos were also your legacy. And you, by your work, would give the henchmen the answer, non omnis moria. That's from Horace, the Latin poet. I shall not wholly die. And I would like just for a minute to roll these names by, and you could just pay attention to the names of our colleagues who participated in the study and were on the faculty of the clandestine medical school as well. The year and place of death is on the right, and their field of interest is in the middle. We are almost done. I just want to finish Dr. Janusz Goldschmidt's story with his partner, Stefania Winzensky, and her staff. They were ordered very early on in August of 42 to march to the Umschlagplatz to be loaded onto trains. There were about 192. They weren't sure the exact number of orphans. Korczak had been offered sanctuary to get out, to get to the Aryan side by the Germans, by the Poles, by Zagota, the underground organization of Poles to help Jews, but he turned it down repeatedly, saying that he could not abandon his children. On August 5th, he again refused offers of sanctuary, insisting that he'd go with the children. And here they are, lined up, getting ready to go, and I just want to, I just can't. But you can see by an eyewitness named Pearl, describes Korczak dressed with his medical bag, the children dressed in, quote, their finest, holding hands, clean, all of them wearing their armbands, and in the back you can see a flag, one side of which was a Jewish star. The Korczak was a writer of children's stories of his book, and the other side was the Zionist flag, which became the flag of Israel. And they marched through the ghetto silently, people watching them, people commenting. And they got to the train station, and you can see Korczak is actually smiling, the children are smiling, and they all board the train, and they're gone. And I like to just finish with this. This is Joshua Pearl, a Yiddish writer who died in Auschwitz. His work was smuggled out of the ghetto in the Ringelbaum archives known as Oneg Shabbat. Unfortunately, I can give you nothing but these few poor words. I cannot give you God, but you must find him in quiet contemplation in your own soul. I cannot give you a homeland, for you must find it in your own heart. I cannot give you love of man, for there is no love without forgiveness. And forgiving is something everyone must learn to do on his own. I can give you but one thing only, a longing for a better life, a life of truth and justice. Even though it may not exist now, it may come tomorrow. Perhaps this longing will lead you to God, homeland, and love. Farewell. Do not forget. Do not forget. Thank you. I think we'll wait for questions for the discussion group. I apologize for running 7 minutes late, but that's what I want.
It was a great talk.
Thank you. I can stay. I don't mind taking questions. Anybody, there's not many people here, but we can do whatever you have to do. Abandon ship, right?
There are a couple questions that you can take. Otherwise, they can also put their questions in the chat, and then you can email them to Dr. Lefrak.
Yep. So if anyone has questions, you can go ahead and submit them here. Dr. Lefrak can email you back responses. He is doing a session at 12:30 today as well via Zoom to continue discussion on this important topic. For those of you who registered into this webinar, I have your emails and I'll be following up this morning's conference with the Zoom link for that 12:30 conference. I don't see any questions that have come through yet. I see maybe one here. Oh, we're getting thank yous. So thank you for joining in this morning. We'll make sure that we share the QR codes.